Welcome back to another episode of Blue Line the Podcast, a podcast created for and aimed at all members of law enforcement. I'm Brittani Schroeder, editor of Blue Line magazine. For today's episode, I'm joined by Stephanie Samuels, who is a psychotherapist who works exclusively with police officers. Today, we're exploring the profound impact of repetitive head trauma on mental health, particularly in law enforcement. And I hope that we're able to highlight some of the recent research and the essential support officers require, ensuring that their physical and mental well-being are both prioritized. These conversations, as you know, are incredibly important. So I really want to say thank you for joining me today, Stephanie.
Truly my honor. Thank you for having me. And we want to make sure that the officers and their families up in Canada know that we're here and we're here for them, and that we can assist in any way.
Amazing. And jumping right in, your work, you've highlighted that repetitive head impacts, or RHI, and trauma are a missing piece in understanding mental health challenges and suicide risk among law enforcement. Now, why do you believe brain trauma symptoms are often mistakenly attributed solely to psychological issues like PTSD, anxiety, or depression within the mental health and law enforcement communities?
Great question. And obviously I sat in that space for decades, thinking that's it. I'm because that made sense. That officers are exposed to, as we know, a tremendous amount of psychological trauma. And so I think it's important to say that they have not been wrongly diagnosed because they are exhibiting, depression, anxiety, PTSD, all those things. They have met all criteria. But what we've never done is we've never asked about their history of what we have termed hit and bop, head impact and trauma, and blast over pressure. So we know that officers have high ACEs score, adverse childhood events. And so not uncommon for them to have grown up in an abusive home. We know that 92% of all officers played sports. Most of them were not golfers, so most of them it was contact sports. And people think they immediately go to American football, and they're like, okay. And the answer is yes, that's where the original research was. However, ice hockey, soccer, wrestling, motocross, boxing, so I mean, all of these are baseball. They have found CTE in baseball players. When you really start understanding, because most people believe that a head injury, you have to hit your head.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to stay with your question on this, and so that we can go. So what happens is that what we start to see is typically what would be known as the early stages of a potential for a neurodegenerative disease, much like, or CTE. The other that has come up is something called interface astroglial scarring, which a lot of times is from blast over pressure injuries, which you see with military. However, you also are going to see that with your SWAT officers, with your firearms. You're
Right.
going to see that with flashbangs, which are concussion grenades. So, so when we start looking at this, and you realize that you can literally have a non-concussive event that you have no symptoms. So you're in the police academy. You've been doing, your grappling, your defensive tactics, your boxing and that stuff. And you don't think twice about it, because you went home, you might have been more tired or whatever. That's not what's registering, right? Because in one's mind, in order for them to have a brain injury, they have to have been involved in an IED explosion. It's like the old PTSD. In order for
Yeah.
me to have PTSD, I need to be a Vietnam vet, right? And so it's along the same line. And we've come a long way since there. Now we understand that that's not the case. And the same thing I think we're going to find with like a traumatic brain injury is you don't have to be blown up by an IED to have a traumatic brain injury.
Yeah.
So there's symptoms that are overlapping. I can literally read you off of, and I do this when I lecture. I put up on a board and I put down the symptoms of, that therapists look at. And they are things like explosivity, loss of control, short fuse, impulsivity, aggression, rage. some physical violence, verbal violence, inappropriate speech, how like they just can't keep their mouths shut. And you're like, what on earth were you thinking? So that's social inappropriateness, disinhibited speech, kind of social isolation. Then you've got depression, hopelessness, suicidality, anxiety, fearfulness, irritability, labile feelings. And the lability is that they easily cry and then laughing at stuff that's inappropriate or the rage. Apathy, truly not giving a crap. And they're like, well, you know what? It's because they've been exposed to so much. It's like they just can't. We have literally figured out and put words into what we're seeing as our own agenda rather than being able to look outside the box for something else. So fatigue, flat affect, insomnia, we know that sleep disturbances are huge, the mood
Hmm.
swings, and then, memory impairment, the executive functioning, the making decisions, lack of insight, perseveration, all those things that I've now described are all of the psychological components. However, those are all the symptoms of CTE.
That's the list is huge. And I bet actually, like you said, putting it up on the screen on a presentation and actually just seeing them all right in front of you, it might be shocking to the people who are in the audience.
Yeah. And I put it up and I wrongfully put it up and I say, this is what clinicians are dealing with. And then the next slide is I say, nope, symptoms literature is in the literature. That is, in the peer-reviewed literature, that is, it actually is the factors of CTE. And I'm like,
Wow.
as a clinician, you have only looked at these under one microscope and
Wow.
departments as well. So being able to now have a different tool, like we don't diagnose, I certainly can't diagnose a brain injury, but I can ask really good questions. And I'll start off, in Copline is the only hotline that we know of that is actually asking questions about hit and bop.
Hmm.
So we've had it also because if I say, just like in the NFL years ago, if you said to an NFL player, have you ever had a concussion? I'm going to tell you that probably 90% of them are going to say no. If you ask somebody if they've ever gotten their bell rung, if they've ever seen stars,
Hmm.
or if they've ever gotten up and shook their head, those are all literally signs of concussion. Dr. Nowinski and Dr. Jansevier did a study on what they call shake, and it's a shaking of the head after a kinesiotic, got to get that word straight, event, and that's what is actually happening is that they're trying to kind of get the brain fog. And if you watch sporting events, and Dr. Nowinski literally can show event after event after event where you just watch people in all different sports just getting up going. And I'm watching on videos and stuff of police officers that are doing the same thing time and time and
Wow.
time again. And then they're going from call to call to call. So being able to have other tools and for our listeners to be trained and to be able to say, I know this is going to sound crazy, but bear with me.
Hmm.
Like there's method to the madness. And you're getting a caller that most of the time's older, and being able to say, did you ever play contact sports as a kid? The person's thinking to themselves, you're going to go back to when I was 8 years old. Like this just is very insane. And then to understand that literally the brain keeps score, that it never stops. It's like a notch on a belt.
Hmm.
And it can't be seen right now. Our imaging isn't that good. So we know that it becomes cumulative. And when you think about as a kid, did you fall off your bike? How many times did violent homes, not uncommon for an abuser to hit the kid open-handed, slap him in the head. Motor vehicle accidents. I've had my own patients, again, I'm seeing people that they're older. I've never asked them, hey, did you play contact sports as a kid? Like I now have an incredibly thorough hit and bob self-assessment, very thorough. That goes back. I didn't know that a lot of my patients, when they were little, had been in car accidents with their parents. And one of them told me the story. Parents were taken to the hospital from the car. He went to school, except he threw up in school. went
Oh,
to the nurse, and then he was taken to the hospital. And he's like, Steph, I haven't thought about that. He goes, I don't even know. He goes, I don't know what I was diagnosed with. He said, now I can, you're right. I'm sure I was diagnosed with a concussion. But that's kind of where it started. And then he played, he started playing football. He was Pop Warner from the time he was about 8,
wow.
and went up through high school, and then became, an active officer. It just kind of keeps going. So really understanding that it's not about a concussion. It's not
Hmm.
about being diagnosed. It is truly about that repetitive head trauma and the blast over pressure. We have a decent percentage of officers that come from the military side.
Hmm.
Most of the damage is done, and we can learn so much from the NFL and the studies and the research that have come out. I mean, bless those guys. That most of it is going to be done in training, right? Because game day, whether it's in the NFL or whether it's on the job, game day normally isn't as, you know, continuously physically draining as trainings are. So
Yeah.
you go to defensive tactics and you spend 8 hours doing your thing on mats, red man suit, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of times officers come home and they're exhausted, right? And the spouse says, where do you want to go for dinner? And the officer says, I don't care.
Yeah.
Like, what do you want for dinner? I don't care. It's like, and there is some resentment because there's this feeling like you've been at work all day long. You've been able to function at this incredible level. You've been making life and death decisions potentially, and you can't decide whether or not you want a hot dog or a hamburger. So, a lot of times, what I have found now, having asked so many questions about hit and bop, is that I learned about something called cognitive reserve that they have literally used. When we talk about like they have nothing left in their tank. So I'm like, okay, well, what does that look like when you have nothing left in your tank? It's a cognitive reserve. So there's actually a neurological you know, explanation for what's going on.
Hmm.
That their brain, and particularly when there is a potential issue with a frontal lobe, is that they have been hyper focusing to make up for some neurological struggles. And so they have used everything they can, and they literally come home and their brain just has to rest.
Yeah.
And being able to understand this changes things. If one can understand that my loved one is not doing this because they're trying to stick it to me, or that they can be a hero, right? The word hero for everybody else. But for me and the kids, I get this whole other side of them. If somebody can understand that that other side of them is a neurological exhaustion and that they literally have to rest, and that if you're going to tax them, they will in all likelihood go out to dinner, but going out to dinner on a taxed brain looks like this. I now have to go out with my family. I am going to sit with my back towards the wall. I'm going to be looking at the front door. I'm
Yeah.
going to make sure that my loved one and my kids are safe. I am now going to have to continue revving up everything in my body to be able to do this. I have little left in my brain to be able to spend. I'm not going to have a wonderful conversation
Hmm.
because I'm truly on edge because I'm still having to perform the duties of a police officer. So, an understanding with a spouse and with kids that says, "Hey, dad's going to be better or mom's going to be better day 2 of their day off,
Hmm.
and day 1 of their day off, they need to stay off of all the computers, right? Because we can't continue to tax a brain.
Yeah.
They just need to kind of veg out.
Yeah.
That it will gain a much more fruitful social environment and less resentment on everybody's part. The other thing is, most officers have no idea why this is going on.
Hmm.
They themselves haven't been educated. This is so new. Yet if you and I would now just randomly call police officers and say, hey, have you Have you ever heard of CTE? Most are going to say yes because they've heard of it with football. So they'll be like, and that's their frame of reference.
Yep.
In Canada, I'd like to believe that, hockey too. This has really become significant in hockey. So I think in that vein, but if you also talk about traumatic brain injury, I think that they would also tell you that that's military, that
Yep.
that you need to be in a Humvee and you need to be blown up on the side of a road, and then you can justify having a brain injury. Whereas this stuff just doesn't make sense. Dr. Danzivier had done I believe it was Dr. Danzivier that had done a longitudinal study where they had put, the researchers had put sensors in the helmets of NFL players, but they did it starting in middle school. So they did middle school, high school, collegiate, and NFL and professional. And what they were studying was they were trying to figure out, do repetitive head impacts really cause, right, causal, CTE.
Hmm.
And what we found is that it is the G force of the hit that becomes the most significant. So depending on what position somebody played, you can kind of look at it and the length of time that they played that sport, that became predictable. But what they also saw is, and I'm going to get this wrong, but it's over 200 hits. So that they could have received 230, I think it's a little higher than that, 30 hits, all of which resulted in a non-concussive experience. They had no symptoms. Yet, on let's say the 231st hit, the G force was less than what they had experienced with the other 230, and yet they had symptoms. So those 230, obviously the G force counted. They just
Yep.
didn't experience any symptoms. So it's how we are really starting to understand that. The other thing that was fascinating was that the greatest G force hit came in high school, not in collegiate and not in the NFL. So I
Wow.
absolutely lost the form on that. So question was why? And what they came up with was that neck muscles had not been fully developed
Oh,
until after. Yep.
right.
Yep. Like
Wow.
it makes sense when you piece these things together. And
Yeah.
that's one of the really beautiful things in being able to talk about this is I can't tell you how many countless officers have come up to me after lecturing, pretty emotional, saying, thank you.
No.
Like, this makes sense. Because they couldn't understand many times, like they both, they experienced a traumatic event.
Hmm.
But so did another officer who was there with them. They are doing poorly, and the other officer seems to be fine. And the question is why? Am I weak? And the answer is no. Having other tools than the buzzwords of we can refer you to a culturally competent therapist.
Right.
And the truth is that most culturally competent therapists, including myself, I did consider myself quite culturally competent up until 3 years ago, never asked these questions. And yet it is imperative that these questions get asked. Copline last month, almost 85% of all of our callers had a history of hit or bop.
Wow.
85%. I mean, we know that in the general population, that suicide is 2.5 times higher in those with brain injury.
Hmm.
We also know that in law enforcement, that the highest suicide rates are between the ages of 39 and 49. NFL, we know that the symptoms really start to hit in the 40s. I don't think this is coincidence, but again, we need empirical data. But when one looks at this, and Brent was in his 40s as well.
Honestly, I think that just really shows how complex this is and that there's been so much research done into the sports side of it, but it's really just getting started on the law enforcement policing side of it. So again, I'm just want to say I'm really happy that we're talking about this today. But earlier, you mentioned some of the various forms of head impacts that police officers go and experience throughout their careers. Now, I want to go back to that a little bit and ask about what are the most significant sources of these impacts? And then on the other end of it, what specific proactive measures, such as policy changes or training protocols, can departments implement to better protect their officers' brain health?
Great questions. So starting in police academies, defensive tactics, red man suit, boxing. Depending on firearms, as well. There is a study out of the Ohio State. Another researcher, Jackie Cassay, did a whole study there, and just once again, is finding exactly what the rest of us are looking at, which is the concussion piece. So now you get out of the academy, and if an officer thinks about how many times they have jammed on their brakes for a quick stop, and again, objects in motion stay in motion, objects at rest stay at rest, so that even though you've stopped, your brain is in fluid. So it is still going and it's going,
Mm-hmm.
right? Again, no imaging is going to find it, but not uncommon to watch an officer get out of the car and go,
Yep.
right? And then they continue on to their call. I can't tell you how many officers have talked about how many times they hit their head getting in and out of their vehicle, hit their head on the trunk of a car.
Yep.
Now think about the fights, the falls, the trips, taking down a suspect. You are going with them. All of those different pieces you don't think about because it's just part of your day. EVOC training, the emergency vehicles, where they literally are taking vehicles and they are learning how to drive in, weaving in and out, doing it frontwards, backwards. I say when I took, my driving, class when I was 16, 15, whatever I was, they did not give me a helmet. And the person sitting next to me was not in a helmet. In EVOC training, they're in helmets. Like this should say, this should be something that we really look at.
Mm-hmm.
And then you go into your specialty units, and particularly when you're going into SWAT. And we know that that's where your greatest exposure to blast over pressure injuries are going to be.
Mm-hmm.
So, flashbangs are known, like I said, as concussion grenades. So, I've got a couple of my guys, bless them. And they used to talk about, once I started doing this and got some decent understanding, and we talked about flashbangs, one was like, we used to throw them at each other for fun. And and I laugh, but this is literally, I mean, the way that they work is that they disorient you, and so then the cops can come in. When you ask them, how many times do you think you've been exposed? I mean, it's not hundreds. They're expensive and they're not typically done, but it's dozens over the years.
Mm-hmm.
And then depending on where they were at the time that the flashbang was thrown into the call. And yeah, and that doesn't always, that sometimes gets a little dicey once you're in there,
Mm-hmm.
arresting somebody. So you've got that. And then depending on the caliber of firearms, is that, for my firearms instructor, they are literally exposed to thousands and thousands of rounds when they're instructor. And the brain continuously experiences effects from this. Border Patrol, which people don't even think about. Most of the time, Border Patrol, they're on horses, they're on ATVs, they're in boats. Those are, if you think about a boat, if you think about ATV, if you think about the jarring, you
Mm-hmm.
think about horses, like motorcycle cops. All of these different factors. And you think to yourself, I'm thinking it's kind of like wisdom teeth. I'm not so sure that we weren't that like we should have been designed better, right? That we should have had some type of brain inoculation.
Yep.
And although they looked at this and said, hey, brains weren't made to play football, I'm not so sure that brains were meant to do this job
Mm-hmm.
with zero protection. And even if you are in a helmet, your brain is still going to be rattled around.
Mm-hmm.
People, it's like I'm glad that we've got better helmets, but at the end of the day, it is only a piece of this. So you look at all these different things and you say, okay, what can we do? So we are introducing, I'm hoping that California will be the first to introduce legislation for best practices and protocol. And it starts in the academy. So that most of the time in the academies, you get blocks. So you get your defensive tactics block, you get your firearms block. So if you understand this, you can set up blocks differently. So if I'm boxing or doing, MMA stuff, whatever it is, on Monday, then on Tuesday, I'm going to do some type of classroom type work.
Right.
So you don't put that defensive tactics in the same block either as firearms, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you can't do that. You really need to get a best practices with somebody that understands the brain. And that's
Yep.
not me. That's somebody like, a Dr. Dan Severe, Dr. Cantu, a Dr. Noe, like there's a whole group, right? It's not Stephanie Samuels. But we know that those people exist.
Yep.
Let's utilize best practices. Let's utilize the true brilliance that's out there to be able to design a way of being able to help our officers. And then they graduate from the academy. So it would start there. After one gets on the job, I would say within inside of the first 6 months, I would love to have a neuropsych evaluation, a baseline to work from. I do not believe in it at pre-employment levels. I think there's enough going on there. I don't believe that an exclusion should ever be military or contact sports or any of that. Those are your guys,
Mm-hmm.
men, women. That's who you want on the force anyway. But to be able to grab and figure they've already passed a physical and a psychological. Okay, so that's the initial threshold.
Mm-hmm.
But then inside of that first, 6 months, maybe a year, that everybody in the department gets a baseline, and that neuropsych sits wherever, right? If it sits in their permanent file, whatever, with their medical information,
Mm-hmm.
and then I'd say every 5 years that they get neuropsych evaluations done. However, the exception is if they end up in other units. So if I'm now going to be transferred and I'm going to be a defensive tactics instructor, at that time, I need a baseline to be done. If I haven't had a baseline done, let's say in the last 12 months, then I'm going to have a baseline done as I go into defensive tactics.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I leave defensive tactics, if I'm going back on the street, I'm going to once again have a baseline done because I need to, and this is not subjective testing. Coming to see Stephanie Samuels, I'm the subjective person, right? Even those that do fitness for duty exams, although they're giving MMPIs and other types of psychological tests, whether it's Beck, depression inventory, still more subjective because we don't necessarily know what an underlying piece is. Neuropsych testing very different. So and defensive taxes is only one. I'm going to tell you evoc instructors. I'm certainly going to tell you those on SWAT. All of those pieces. And while they're in the units, that the 5 year period shrinks down to either every 12 or 24 months because we don't want to keep officers in these positions that are going to end up being affected and struggle.
Right.
And whether best practices says no matter what, I mean, the amount of money that goes into training an officer, whether it be for SWAT or for defensive tactics or whatever, we have to look at that as well. So you can't say, well, we've got to rotate them every year, every 2 years. But we need to understand this. And maybe the way of doing it is if they have a neuropsych, which is really hard to BS. Because you can't do better. You
Yeah.
can through the test probably and do worse, but you're not going to be able to do better than you want to. So at some point in time that maybe that becomes, if we start to see that there's a decline or what have you, then they get pulled out earlier. But they also get help.
Yep.
You just don't pull them out. And that's the other piece. There's all different types of therapy
Mm-hmm.
that can be done if we understand what's going on and what's going to help. So that would be what I would look at and absolutely love. The other piece is officers that get sent for fitness for duties. So you've got an officer who has already been identified as having an issue,
Mm-hmm.
depression, impulsivity, what have you, and they go for fitness for duty. We need to change how those fitness for duties are done. The questions on hit and bop must be incorporated because if those become factors, then those officers need to be sent for a neuropsych evaluation. Because the problem is I have literally over my career had countless referrals from fitness for duties where the officers are sitting there, they have been impulsive, there's been something that's landed them. And because I never asked these questions, I truly believe I became part of the problem. Did they do better in my practice? They did do better. But the underlying components I don't think were dealt with.
Right.
So I began to do the hit and bop self-assessment in my practice. 87% of my patients ended up being referred to a neurologist, and most of them have already gone through their neuropsychs, two different components. And with my guys, they're paying for the neuropsychs out of their pocket through, healthcare or whatever. And I say to them, stick it in your safe. Because if we have a neuropsych evaluation done 5 years from now and it's showing significant changes, you've got a baseline and a presumptive injury. They
Hmm.
haven't been exposed to anything else. And that is something that can save their careers or save their pensions. So, we were so grateful that Brent's wife was able to donate his brain, because being able to have that case, and what she had seen and the changes and the disappointment. Brent had been hospitalized. Brent had done everything that we as people in this field say. You need to talk to somebody, right? You need to go to a psychiatrist. You need to see a therapist. If it's that bad, we've got culturally competent inpatient facilities, culturally competent residential facilities. None of these places ended up asking these questions.
Hmm.
One did a brain scan. The brain scan can't show this, and yet, they're saying, here's your depression, here's your PTSD, here's your, no, no, he had CTE, guys. He was showing every sign of that,
Hmm.
except nobody took in account that he had done 6 or 7 years in defensive tactics.
Yeah.
There was a question, he had played contact sports. This was no pro athlete. Most of the people had. He had done military. He had not seen combat. Training wasn't it, and it was years and years before. CTE stage 1 is typically with inside of around 10 years. It was what fit in the defensive tactics arena. And yet, do again, the brain keeps score, but you're not going to get somebody in this field that doesn't have that. If your brain was not exposed to day in and day out defensive tactics for all those years, do I believe that Brent's CTE would have played out the way that it did? No.
For our listeners who might not know, CTE stands for chronic traumatic encephalopathy. I think I said that right.
Yes, you did.
And for anyone who doesn't know the case of Brent Simpson, he was the first publicly known officer who was diagnosed with CTE. And it showed how profound behavioral and personality changes can occur even in early stages of brain injury and often without a diagnosis or a correct diagnosis. So, building off of that, and you kind of mentioned it a little bit with Brent's wife, what are some subtle signs that officers and their families or their colleagues should watch out for, especially when other mental health diagnoses don't seem to fully explain their struggles?
The personality changes, I think that's really big. Not joking around like they used to. Hypervigilance going to more paranoia, more isolation. Interestingly enough, people that seem to be diagnosed with CTE, it is common for them to say something about there's something wrong with my brain.
Hmm.
So, and I know that Brent had done this, and again, I believe that he had also seen a neurologist. Not all neurologists are created equal. I'm very blessed here in New Jersey that I've got a phenomenal neurologist that I'm just inundating with cases, and they're difficult cases, but he understands what he's looking at and the likelihood that these guys all have post-concussions syndrome, so PCS, and then that most of them are dealing with probable CTE.
Hmm.
So able to kind of help them understand what's going on and help the spouses. So that was something. I think the other piece of it is because they are going to mirror the mental health pieces so strongly, is to be able to do a much deeper dive. Look at the Concussion Legacy Foundation. They did a brilliant law enforcement breakout website that people that want to look at the possibility of an issue, they can fill out the helpline form. They can do it through an encrypted means as well. They did that on the site to be able to get the potential right help and another diagnosis. Again, my patients are still seeing me,
Hmm.
right? Because the diagnosis is correct. But let me tell you, getting them in to these other two prongs, the neuropsychologist and the neurologist, has been incredible. It also has changed their medications. So when you've got an officer that's dealing with rage and mood lability, there is actually a drug that deals with that. But when you only go see a psychiatrist and a psychiatrist doesn't understand comorbidity,
Hmm.
does, it isn't an expert, they're going to be giving you psych meds to treat the explosivity. And many times it doesn't help. Sleep issues. So we also know that people with brain injuries have a higher percentage end up with early onset Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and ALS. So if we start to notice, so, concentration issues, memory issues, a lot of times, again, we assign it to trauma, right? It's another comorbid factor when it comes to depression and PTSD. Memory
Hmm.
issues and concentration are there. But once we understand that this could actually be neurologically based, we need to now look at the potential that this is an early onset, because if that's the case, they're going to need to be prescribed medications for Alzheimer's.
Hmm.
Your Ariceps and your other meds, again, not a doctor, but this is what, typically they will now do to slow down the progression of that protein. So that the importance of having that right diagnosis is so key. And for clinicians like myself that are talking to these patients, to be able to help them understand, to give them other tools, it has been so rewarding. The ability for our volunteers on Copline to be able to direct them to a website, and they try and do this while they're on the phone with them. If they can access the website, because when you start looking at the website and you're on a website called the Concussion Legacy Foundation, right? You're not on mental health issues for
Yeah.
law enforcement, but you're on something that's dealing with a concussion website,
Hmm.
and you are reading every friggin' symptom that you have. You're like, oh my God, I never thought about this. And that becomes a gift, because I will certainly tell you that it is far easier to get a cop into a neurologist's office than it is to get them into a psychiatrist's office.
You mentioned actually the Concussion Legacy Foundation, and after much advocacy, the Unite Brain Bank and the Concussion Legacy Foundation have expanded their research into including law enforcement and other
Yes.
first responders. So this takes us back to the research part of our talk here, and I'd love to know what you think are some key insights that you hope that this expanding research efforts will provide to the first responder community about the long-term impacts of brain trauma while they're on the job, and how also these findings can directly benefit the current officers, but also future officers.
Great questions. The hopes is understanding suicide. We have been, I think, as a whole, as a population that has any connection to law enforcement, the level of frustration, the sense of helplessness, all the things that cops can't stand and none of us can. That if we can, we know that there's a missing piece, right?
Hmm.
I've gone to enough conferences, but being able to go to these conferences and have people come up to me going, "Oh my God, you're the founder of Copline, and blah blah blah," and I think, and I typically will say, which is why I don't go. I'm like, listen, we all suck. None of us have figured out how to get these suicide rates down, right?
Yeah.
So while everybody's so busy patting themselves on the back, I'm like, I don't know if anybody's patting themselves. Yes, Copline has helped. All the other organizations, they've helped, but the bottom line is we're recycling
Yep.
stuff, right? If you go back to the 1940s, there was a psychologist by the name of Viktor Frankl. He had been in a concentration camp. He literally is the founder of post-traumatic growth. This is nothing new. You talk about resiliency. Resiliency is easy. How did you survive every worst day of your life up until today? Figure
Hmm.
that out, use it, we're good, right? We know that cops are the most resilient population. They typically are a population that grew up in crisis, in abusive homes or what have you. They are where they are. Okay. Like, look, we're just, we've got wellness apps, we've got wellness units, we've got all this, and yet every year it is the most frustrating to look at this and say, we can't get these suicide rates down.
Hmm.
If we have a comorbid factor of a brain injury that helps understand impulsivity, if in the way that the Unite Brain Bank works, and the way brain donation. So the person donates their brain, or the family member donates their brain, and that and it takes about a year for that brain to be studied. That before you get the results, there is going to be a in-depth conversation so that you've got the psychological side that is going to be asking a ton of questions about your loved one. Okay, what did you notice? All of that, kind of get all the background, but I mean hours and hours of that.
Hmm.
And then you're going to have the pathology part of what is it that we looked at and we saw in his brain. Those two different parts do not meet until the day that they talk to the donor. So this side doesn't know what this side said. So what they are gaining from this is, what does CTE stage 1 look like, right? What does stage 2 look like? What does
Hmm.
stage 3 and 4 look like? So if you know the person have advanced Alzheimer's, that they have been in a memory facility for years, so we would anticipate that that is a stage probably 4, stage 3, stage 4, because that's where we start seeing a lot of that.
Yeah.
A lot of the neurological and the behavioral and the cognitive pieces are in early stages. But there's an interesting factor that I think we're going to end up really changing the Unite Brain Bank's understanding of law enforcement. See, these other populations they've been studying have never been exposed to the psychological trauma on a frequent basis, except in the law enforcement community.
Hmm.
Military, not so much, because even if they're in a combat zone, they're out of that combat zone typically within inside of 12 months. So, and I would never belittle the military. I mean, truly, God bless them, but
Yeah.
it's still a different component than law enforcement that does 25 years, typically, day in and day out. It's not seasonal. They don't
Yeah.
get pulled out again. So, and we know that chemistry in the brain changes with trauma as well. So when you add these factors, so what we see in CTE stage 1 in a police officer behaviorally, in all likelihood, is going to be quite different than what we see in CTE stage 1 in an athlete. So that's going to be, and so with Brent being the first brain, poor Gina is the advocate saying, I don't think you're taking all this into consideration, because you're thinking he shouldn't be, experiencing all of these different components with a stage 1, which actually I think they're going to find that as they get more brains, that is going to be far more common to have that level of the mental health components with that.
That's incredible. And like you said, we've been recycling the same kind of content and the same information. And now that the research is expanding, hopefully we will start earning those pats on the back, right? We will start actually earning those and start reducing the number of suicides that happen because of these traumatic injuries.
Right.
Now, despite the serious nature of brain trauma and its impacts, you've expressed that there is hope and that head trauma is treatable. You said that in your work. And I wonder what your message of possibility and maybe a clear path forward that you might be able to offer us today, to our listeners, to officers and their families who might be grappling with these challenges in their lives, and what does a successful recovery or symptom improvement typically look like with the proper support behind it.
So Concussion Legacy Foundation has literally put on their website this great piece that shows all the different treatments and stuff. So I will certainly, mention the different ones, but as you can tell, there's a lot, right?
Hmm.
So it's physical therapies, it's psychiatry, it's psychological counseling, it's endocrinology, it's meditation, concussion specialist, neurologist, occupational therapy, cognitive rehab therapy, medications, ENTs, vision therapy, neurooptometric, and neuropsych. I mean, that is just, and one of the first things that they do is that they like to have sleep studies done. Can this be attributed to, we know that if you sleep better, right, the brain rests. So if you've been struggling with sleep apnea and your spouse has been banging on your arm, smacking you for the last, 3 years and has already moved out of the bedroom,
Yeah.
like go get the sleep study because neurologically your brain has to rest.
Hmm.
We know that that's a piece. We do know that eating, that a modified Mediterranean diet seems to also be able to help. And then being able to have all these other pieces. The other thing is the Concussion Legacy Foundation does have support groups. They do have spouse support groups, and they do have support groups for individuals suspected of having CTE. And again, we can't diagnose in the living. I think we are certainly getting closer to that, but to be able to have support groups to be able to really talk about that. I had posted something online in social media, and somebody had written back saying, hey, is there a Leo only, kind of support group for
Hmm.
suspected CTE? And I wrote back and I said, there isn't, not at this point in time, because they were talking about, how they really don't do well with civilians. And I said, they seem to be doing well with athletes. They seem to have very similar drives and personality because your general population really isn't at a high risk for CTE. I am truly not. There's a lot of fights that I'm willing to fight, but that's not one of them. I think they do absolutely great with other people struggling, and I think sometimes they really appreciate being with a different type of uniformed athlete. And I think the other uniformed athletes really have tremendous respect for those that wear that other uniform that has a
Hmm.
badge attached to it. And I have not had anybody that has had an issue being in those groups.
I think keeping that in mind about, the brain needs rest. And like you said earlier, like maybe changing how the training and the academy is done, where you have something that, might impact the brain, like defensive tactics, and then you have it paired with a classroom thing so the brain could rest. Because like you said earlier, the brain keeps score. So I think that is such a key takeaway. And I'm hoping that our listeners are also tuning into the fact that the brain, you got to protect it. It's like you said, it's up there and it's in fluid. So it's got to be protected at all costs. Stephanie, I just want to say thank you so much for today. I know we covered a ton of ground, but we've probably given our listeners a lot to think about. So again, I just really appreciate the time that you've spent with me, the time that you have spent on your research and making sure that these conversations continue to happen because we need to find ways to better support our first responders. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. And if anybody wants to look more into it, Copline has got a whole section now on brain injury, and they can also reach out. I have no problem being able to send out that self-assessment for Hittenbach for anybody that wants to do it, because they can do it at their own leisure, and they can fill it out with a loved one, because there's nobody that's a worse historian than somebody with brain injury. So being able to do that with somebody who's known you and is seeing it is really, really helpful. And then it's emailed to you, and you can take that to any mental health professional that you see, any medical doctor you see, and it's there, it's filled out, and it's tangible. So it hopefully helps get that conversation and treatment underway.
Even though, most of this research is being done in the States, and we were talking about some stats in the States, brains are the same across the board. Police officers in Canada and the US, they're going through the same traumatic
Absolutely.
incidents and experiences. So I think whatever is being done in the States in regards to mental health and these brain injuries and the research, it's going to help us out in Canada as well. So it's just fantastic that it's happening in the first place.
And again, the Concussion Legacy Foundation in Canada, huge props. Had a beautiful meeting with them. They are absolutely so supportive of this, that and they will be helping with referrals. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful collaboration with them. So this is not about the U.S. This is truly about those that wear a uniform any place, and everybody is truly in. They just hadn't thought about what this was doing to our first responders. They never looked at that piece of it. So, Canada is absolutely looking at this as well. So, all exciting. There's no reason why they can't donate their brain up in Canada as well.
I'm really excited to see what further research is done with this. And who knows, maybe in another 2 years, I'll have you back and we'll just talk about all of these updates as they come forward.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much for having me. I truly appreciate it, and I truly appreciate your audience, and and all that you guys are doing up in Canada. You just, stay safe and know that you guys aren't alone.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Now, for everyone who tuned in, we hope you enjoyed this episode of Blue Line the podcast. You can check us out on SoundCloud, Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also stay up to date on all of your Canadian policing news at blueline.ca. Until next time, stay safe and be well.